welcome back to our channel. I'm Ray.
And this is Dr. Zhou.
And in this series, we talk about topics related to hoarding. In conversation with me today is the co-host of this podcast and channel, who is also a clinical psychologist and researcher in the field of hoarding. The topic today is the relationship between hoarding and trauma. So to get started, is there a relationship between trauma and hoarding?
Well, thank you, Ray. Yes, there is actually a relationship with trauma and hoarding, and actually a lot of other things in the mental health field too. So trauma is, we can consider it a major risk factor of a lot of mental health conditions, not just about hoarding, but it's also related to depression, related to obviously post-traumatic stress disorder or complex PTSD, and related to anxiety, related to all these different like diagnosable or subclinical issues that we experience.
Thank you for sharing that. So it sounds like not only is there sometimes a relationship between trauma and hoarding, but it's also kind of mental health broadly. And so if folks are kind of coming in thinking, right, that, I've had some trauma and maybe there's some hoarding, but I also experience maybe anxiety and also depression. Do you see that in your work, or what does that mean for folks when there's kind of multiple things happening at once?
Yes. In fact, that's very common. Right. So in the psychiatry field or the psychology field, we kind of categorize different things. And the reason why we categorize them is so that it's more systematic for us to study it and to know how to treat different things. But if you really think about us humans, it's just one human. And we can kind of put aside these labels, but really just think about how it's just very simple. Like after like our life experiences affect us, and our environment, our temperament affect us, and so how these things interact with each other. So often people would come to treatment, they maybe have experienced trauma, and with some of them it's multiple and complex trauma. With others, it's maybe more like a one-off major trauma with some life stressors that we don't typically label as trauma. But if we kind of put the labels aside, just look at how the different life experiences, especially the more challenging one, how they affect our well-being and how that manifests in like the so-called symptoms or the expression of what we call depression, such as lack of interest, such as sadness, and lack of motivation and lack of self-esteem, and how that also can be related to the so-called symptoms of hoarding. So I don't like the word symptom. I prefer the word behaviors or phenomena of hoarding or feelings related to hoarding. So oftentimes we can get lost or feel like there's a lot of battles to conquer. I have to treat my depression, I have to then treat my PTSD, I have to then treat my hoarding. But it's one person. So if you just find what's the root of all my suffering, and how are these different things related to one another, and treat it from the root, that's the approach that I would take.
Mm-hmm. So if somebody's coming in with kind of holding two things at once, maybe holding trauma and holding hoarding and depression, you're kind of saying that you wouldn't necessarily treat one over the other. Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Yeah. So your question reminds me of sometimes when I consult with other clinicians, they would say, oh, I have a client that I've been working with them on PTSD or complex PTSD. And in that process, I realized, oh, not only that, I also experience hoarding. So what do? I don't know how to treat hoarding. I don't have that specialty or enough training on that. I'm just getting the training from consulting with you. So am I not helping them with their hoarding? And I would say, yes, you're helping them with their hoarding because you are helping them with the impact of trauma. And if we see that the impact of trauma is partially what makes a person having a hard time letting go of things, then helping them with PTSD or the impact of trauma is treating part of the roots of hoarding. And of course, there's some nuance or some like specialized thing related to how to treat hoarding specifically. That's not the same thing as treating PTSD or complex PTSD. But so when we are healing from the more root issues such as trauma, then it's kind of like if you see as a tree, and if the top of the tree there are some branches that are having diseases, and you can go treat the leaves or the branches, or you can go from treating the root, and maybe some of the branches will start to change, not just one branch.
I think that'll be a really helpful kind of metaphor for so many people. And kind of speaking to clinicians, kind of continuing from the previous question, what's something that you wish clinicians knew about the relationship between trauma and hoarding?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, thank you for that great question. So, oftentimes when I say I often get asked by either clinicians or just people in general. They ask me, so why would people hoard, and where does it come from? And my answer is usually it's quite complex, and each individual has different reasons. But what I very commonly see in terms of the similarities across people experiencing hoarding is there some sort of experiences of trauma, and it's not necessarily big capital letter T trauma like witnessing death or losing a loved one by death or sexual or physical abuse. There's that, but not necessarily that. There's also small letter T trauma, such as being neglected as a young person or a young child, or there is growing up with emotionally unavailable family members or caretakers, and there's also bullying. There's also trust issues with people, or growing up with poverty. So some of these like small letter T trauma can be pretty impactful, like even more impactful than some of these like big letter T trauma, because especially a lot of these small letter T trauma is very chronic. It's not just one off. Yeah. And so if we imagine this is just an example of somebody who grew up in an environment there is bullying, maybe in school or by siblings, and there's emotionally unavailable caretaker. And so how is that going to shape their sense of safeness within the world? And if the sense of safeness is not developed that well, then how are they going to cope growing up? And so maybe one of the coping mechanism is to feel like they can own things, they can hold on to things that will not hurt them like people would. Or similarly, if they find it hard to emotionally connect with people because they didn't grow up with that kind of environment to facilitate that kind of behaviors, then perhaps material items become a way of them comforting themselves or even a source of self-esteem. And so that's just one typical scenario. It's not to say that everybody who experiences hoarding has the same story, but the impact of trauma on the self and on attachment and on emotion regulation, I think that's something as a clinician that we can start to think about and how that can be related to hoarding behaviors.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much for elaborating on that. And I think kind of bringing into this space, not only talking about kind of big T traumas, excuse me, that we maybe see kind of being acknowledged in the DSM, but also holding the space for the traumas that don't go as recognized. And I think folks like you in the field are really doing a great job of kind of bringing those to light. And I think that, even folks listening might resonate with, hey, some of those traumas that maybe have gone unrecognized by the mental health field or whomever, or maybe resonating with, yeah, I'm holding this experience too. And I wonder, maybe speaking to them, if there's any resonance for folks listening to this, what is, and don't work in a clinical capacity, what's something that you would like them to know kind of about this relationship between trauma and hoarding?
Yeah, I think that what you're pointing out is quite important and quite common, right? Sometimes people would say, well, what I experienced is nothing. There's like, look at other people, they've gotten worse, so much worse than me. So this is nothing, or this shouldn't have any impact on me. But actually everything has an impact. And especially if it's something that's kind of like a very, like, it's lasted for a long time in your early environment, that is very powerful. Sometimes I hear people say, well, it's not like my parents have hit me, or like, if not, it's not like I didn't have a roof on top of on top of me. But what also matters is what happens under that roof. And so I would say be generous to yourself. And because whenever we say, well, somebody else has a worse, or I shouldn't have been impacted by this, it's like we are not giving us that generosity of care, of acknowledgement, and of the willingness to work with ourselves. We're just denying our experiences and denying our feelings. And so and a lot of these more like subtle things are actually quite impactful, and they shape us in terms of our self-identity. They shape how we believe who we are and what we are worthy of. And they also shape how we believe other people see us and how others would relate to us. And all of these things are quite relevant to hoarding, right? So sometimes I say that I share this experience of earlier in my career when I started to learn about hoarding, and after learning about it and working with people experiencing hoarding, I had this realization that yes, I don't identify as somebody who experienced hoarding, but I do have difficulties letting go as well. But what makes me different from people who I see who have piles and piles of stuff at home that makes their home very difficult to live in, or very difficult to serve functions. I think one of the main things that kind of makes my difficulties letting go not get to that degree is I prioritize myself more, almost. I realize that yes, I have a hard time, like if I have to put things in the landfill, that I also feel, oh, ouch, sorry, landfill. But I also realize, okay, so the fact that I just put it in, instead of like my clients, they will try to save it, try to make it, make a different life of it. It's like they kind of prioritize the object more than they prioritizing themselves. And that pains my heart. That makes me wonder, what makes your experience so that you feel like the objects are more important than you? And what have you experienced in your life that's kind of like reinforcing that message, that you are less important than your things. So that's kind of like we started to experience, started to question, okay, what are the impact of different life experiences? And some we may call even like big letter T trauma. Some we may not even call trauma, but what are the experiences that you have experienced that kind of shape your relationship with yourself, with your object, and with other humans?
Mm-hmm. That sounds like kind of just bringing everything in to create this kind of full picture of understanding the human that's in front of us, or the human that we are, and that traumas do have an impact as well as other things.
Right.
And I'm wondering kind of, if folks are listening and saying, I hear this information, I've experienced trauma, I'm experiencing hoarding, and I want to heal some of this stuff. Yeah, what does that look like for folks?
Because I'm trying to imagine all the different people who are perhaps listening to this and where they may be, but I guess I can never guess where they are on their journey of healing. But I'm just gonna assume that if I'm speaking to somebody who is like just freshly recognizing, oh my goodness, I'm experiencing hoarding, or this thing that I'm doing or experiencing is called hoarding. There's a label to it. And what do I do? Yeah, how do I feel? How do I heal? So I would say that sometimes when we recognize or when we put a label on a behavior, it can be useful in helping us to give it a name, and so we can talk about it, or so we can understand it, we can learn about it, and we can think about it, right? So that can be useful. And other times that can be like a mask. So you're just calling it hoarding. I'm just doing this hoarding thing. And then you're just seeing the outside of the box. Then you don't open the box to see what's inside of the box of the so-called hoarding. So I would say that if you just freshly recognize, okay, this behavior is called hoarding that I've been engaging in for a couple of years, then I would encourage you to open the box of the so-called hoarding and unpack it. And what would it look like then? It's like, for example, you can say, okay, so what is hoarding? When you are bringing in flyers or bringing some objects from outside, then you ask yourself, oh, is this quote unquote hoarding, or what is hoarding, and why am I bringing these in? Or kind of like when we say why, a lot of times we're not really wondering why. We're just saying, why are you doing this, like a judgment. But what I mean here by why is a real why. It's a genuine why. It's a real question. It's a genuine openness and curiosity of, okay, if this is called hoarding, where does this come from? Before I bring these things in, how did I feel? How did this happen? What am I doing and how am I feeling? Is this a coping mechanism? And what am I trying to cope with? How am I suffering? So be very curious and ask a lot of questions, and that will help you to kind of get to this human, not just see the label of your behaviors. And I would say that that's the first step, because if we skip that step, any treatment or any groups or any self-help thing that you do, it can only be more and more judgment on yourself. And the more judgment you put on yourself, even if by judging yourself, by pushing yourself hard, you can get rid of some things, it's not going to be sustainable. Because we want it to be sustainable. We want this as a kind of like a kindness process. It's kind of like a me time. When you're sorting your physical boxes, it's a me time. You're wanting to do this to get to know yourself and get to know how you can help yourself, how you can heal yourself, how can you love yourself better.
Yeah, that just reminded me of kind of the kind of like genuine care you were talking about earlier, and kind of that by kind of opening this metaphorical box and inviting curiosity, that this is kind of one thing that can serve as kind of turning towards or prioritizing the self, because yeah, every individual is so important.
Right.
So kind of as we're wrapping up for today, I'd be curious to hear kind of over the course of your work in this field, what has been something that's really kind of resonated or stuck out to you in terms of the conversation about trauma and hoarding?
So that's a good question. And many clinical experiences are popping up in my mind right now. And I'm thinking about how to describe them to sum it all up. Yeah. I think well, before I share that, I think that I forgot to mention earlier how because when you asked me the first question about how hoarding and trauma are related, I said that trauma is affecting many mental health conditions, not just hoarding. But I also would like to add that not only trauma is affecting hoarding, just like other mental conditions, but also that there's a very high percentage of exposure to trauma among the hoarding population. So we did a survey, we did a research project a couple of years ago. We interviewed people who have been diagnosed with hoarding disorder, and we gave them a checklist of trauma. And this is capital letter T trauma, which means natural disaster, car accident, sudden death or loss of a loved one, and physical, sexual assaults, all of these like big letter T trauma identified in DSM-5. And over 95% of the people who currently meet the diagnostic criteria for hoarding, they have reported more than one type of trauma in their lifetime. And the average types of trauma these people experienced was 7. So it wasn't just like 7 incidents, it's 7 types of trauma, some of which are repetitive. And so this is a heavily traumatized population. So the trauma is very prevalent, and it's more prevalent than people experiencing depression and other mental health, many other mental health conditions. I don't know if it's the most prevalent, but it's quite prevalent in this population. And so circle back to your last question about how like what I would say in terms of what I've seen in working with people healing their trauma and their hoarding. It's kind of like braiding your hair. So you pull one string and then you pull the other one. And so we look at the trauma and we heal the trauma. And when we do this, we kind of like just hold the hoarding, know that hoarding is happening, but let's focus on healing the trauma. And then when that is healed to maybe like 1 degree, and then the person will start very naturally without prompting, they will want to let go a little bit more of their physical items. And then we will start to braid this other part of the hair, which is the hoarding, and then we'll work on that, and very naturally we'll hit a place where we realize, oh yeah, that my trauma is related to this stickiness of or the attachment to doing more, like being the perfect way of getting rid of my items or having a hard time letting things go. Then we braid back to the trauma part of the hair again. So it's kind of like this this process of going between trauma healing and hoarding specific healing, trauma healing, hoarding specific healing. And I often say to clients, you come in to see me specifically for hoarding, and a lot of times people's objective of healing hoarding is I want to get rid of my stuff. And so healing looks like very open space, no clutter. And while that could be an outcome, but if you are living with your stuff and you don't have any problem with it, why do we want to do that? So we are wanting to do that must because there's something underneath you are holding on to stuff that is something that we can work with. It's almost like the wanting to work on this visible layer of situation is an opportunity for you to look deeper to see the real source of suffering. And so we work there, and while that improves, chances are the superficial layer of the quote-unquote symptom that you see will naturally improve.
Thank you so much for kind of circling back on what you saw kind of in your research. And I think really just kind of having this conversation today and offering us your wisdom too on such an important topic, and one that I think deeply resonates in many communities and communities that we're a part of. So just wanted to thank you so much for kind of being here, for sharing with me, with everyone else. And just wanted to kind of end by passing it over to you, just if you had any kind of last things that felt important or that you wanted to say to folks before we say goodbye.
Well, I think that I wanted to just name it, that we want to just keep coming back to compassion. Yeah, so compassion here means really having the wisdom to see why and how you suffer, and really having the deep level and deep way of care about wanting to help yourself. And so you want to have the wisdom and wanting to have the kind of motivation to want to help, and wanting to have that almost that friendliness and care that you want to help, rather than you're just being there very judgmental of yourself and like almost like a teacher holding a stick, like, why are you not doing it already? Yeah, so just come back, keep coming back, even towards even compassion towards the judgmental part of yourself. I bet they are doing that for good reasons too, but they're not quite helpful always. Yeah, so we keep coming back to being more compassionate, which doesn't mean complacent, which means understanding the real reason and real source of the problem and address it from there kindly.
Oh, what beautiful words to leave us with. Thank you so much, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.